Okay, one of the things that confuses people most about Gothic is this alternation between uh, the letter that's like spelled B, the letter that's spelled F, um, and the letter that's spelled G, and the letter that's spelled Thorn is like the Old English name and also the Gothic name. Um, and it can be pretty confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it, and hopefully you'll understand it better, or, well, at all if you didn't know anything about this before. So first of all, I'll talk about the origins of the different letters, and for the first one, berka, the one that looks like a B, it comes from Proto-Germanic b, which had is believed to have an allophone of v, 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 very similar to the sound of v, but when you say v, your teeth are against your lip, whereas when you say v, you're just putting your lips together. And let's see, so we have Proto-Germanic beranang, which becomes beran. Siluvrang becomes siluvr. Lambang becomes lamb. And revo becomes reva. And these are just some examples. But then we also have fa, which is like fa, but you say it with your lips. So you get fehu, or I guess fehu, becomes fehu. Fimf becomes fimf. Wolfong becomes wolf. But you also get it from Proto-Germanic b, or v, after vowel. So you have rab becomes rav. Then we have d. I think the letter is dax, is what it's called. And it comes from Proto-Germanic da, which has an allophone the. So dauthus becomes dothus. Fodrong becomes fodr. Landong becomes land. Godo becomes goda. But here we have this thorn letter. We have Thiuda from Thiudo. Protri becomes prothr. Queth becomes quith. But you can also get it from da, so, or the. So rodas becomes roths. And then we also have ra. And ra is a little bit simpler because there's nothing for it to alternate with in Gothic, at least. So we have revo becomes reva, lerang becomes ler, langang becomes lang, managu becomes managa. And if you notice, this is the symbol for ra. And this is considered like the more normal pronunciation. So even though if this was started with a B, it would be bevo. It's still it's still fricative, even though it's at the beginning of the word. And so we can see some. I've actually reused this. I've used this slide in a different slideshow, but it's. I didn't see any reason to change it for this one. So we have Goths, Rotha, Roth, where we have this alternation. And this is from Rotha's. So Gothic has this thing called devoicing, and it causes an alternation where when it comes word finally, or before an S, and there's just a vowel before it, no consonant, it devoices. So the devoices to the, devoices to th, and occasionally you still see it written as if it was voiced, which is interesting. For 𝐻, however, it's always written as if it was voiced. You never see this sort of like confusion where it's alternating with anything. And there's no alternation if it comes from th. So it might be difficult looking at a word like 𝌻𐌰𐌽. That could have come from Proto-Germanic 𝌻𐌰𐌽 or 𝌻𐌰𐌽. And you just have to know the etymology to know which one it is. And that's really the base of what confuses everyone. And because if you look at a word like Goths, you see this alternation. So, and a very similar system exists in Old English, where th and the alternate, and it looks very like this. It's very much like that on the surface. But what you're really seeing in Gothic is a devoicing of this the to th, whereas what you're seeing in Old English is a voicing of the to the. And that's important because Gothic still has a th sound. It still has a v. It still has a f sound. And you can see that in 𝑍𝍉𝐼𝐴. If this was an Old English word, you would get 𝑍𝍉𝐼𝐴. And 𝑍𝍉𝐼𝐴 would be the same. But because it's a Gothic word, it stays 𝑍𝍉𝐼𝐴. We don't merge f and v in the middle of words, only at the ends of words, and when not preceded by a consonant. So you can see here we actually do have this land with a d at the end, and the reason it's believed to be d as opposed to th is because it's still written with a d, and it makes sense that an n would prevent the d from becoming a fricative, and the same is true for lamb. It stays with this b. Dumb and dumbs also has a hard b, and freons, and these are just example words. This just to demonstrate how the language works in general. So you can hear how I pronounce these words. So I guess that's like a bit of a spoiler because you can hear me saying them earlier in the slideshow, but whatever. They were most likely pronounced the after a vowel, and as plosives after a consonant. But that doesn't. We can't really tell how they were pronounced at the beginning of a word based on the spelling, because there's like if I go back to the beginning, brothr, we would not expect this to become frothr or prothr or anything that could tell us. There's no alternation that tells us whether this is a fricative or not. So you could say prothr, you could say vrothr, and neither of those are wrong based on the spelling, because b, this berka, represents both b and v, and the same is true for dachs. It can represent the as in the, and it can, it can represent like de as in dothus and land. But you could say this is dothus, and there wouldn't be really anything wrong with that. And I'll get to how I say it exactly. But let's look at some languages with similar systems. So Spanish is probably the most similar to Gothic. I've just screenshotted Wikipedia. I don't know if you're going to think I'm lazy for doing that, but I think it's fine. The phonemes b, d, g, and g are pronounced as voice stops only after pause, after a nasal consonant, or in the case of d, after a lateral consonant. In all other contexts, they are realized as approximates, namely v, the, g, hereafter represented with the downtracks, or fricatives. So this is a very similar system to Gothic. And in Spanish, you can have a word that starts with a b, but if the preceding word ends in a vowel, that can cause it to become v. And the thing is, if you're, from Spain, you speak Spanish natively, this doesn't feel to you like two different sounds. So one thing I've heard said is, why would b all of a sudden become v just because it's in a compound or at the beginning of a word? If you think of these as the same sound, it doesn't really feel like it's changing. It's just that word boundaries can cause changes in pronunciation, certainly. If you look at the word the in English, you might say the apple, but the bone, the apple, with this E, the apple, or the apple is, I think, how I say it. But another thing is an apple versus a bone. And it's changing based on the following word. And sometimes this is something that speakers are aware of, and other times it's not. I would say in Spanish, and I don't think. Well, I saw a YouTube video where someone was explaining how this works in Spanish, and the comments were all, Spaniards saying, this is not how the Spanish language works, so you're just a gringo making stuff up or whatever. I don't want to discount those people too much, because I can understand why they would think that, but really, when you're looking at language from a scientific point of view, you can notice these sounds without those sounds being noticed as different sounds by native speakers of the language. So a Spaniard doesn't think, oh, it's vaca, but la vaca. They would just think of that as one sound. I think it's a similar thing is spin versus pin, where pin has that p, whereas spin doesn't have that p. You don't say spin. You don't say stone. You say stone and versus tone. Stone sounds different than stone. And in a language like ancient Greek, you might have a difference between t and the t, like in stone in English, but that's not a distinction we make in English, and as such, we tend to think of this as one sound, even though it's pronounced differently based on the environment. And for language like Spanish, it is something that can change based on a preceding word. So it might be tempting to think of Gothic as having, b, d, g, and v, g as these separate sounds, and the is always the, and d is always d. But it's fully possible that to a Goth, d and the would just be the same sound, and pronouncing b as v after a vowel in a preceding word would be as natural as to a Goth as a Spaniard saying vaca, but a vaca. Another language with a similar system is Japanese. I think it's not as similar to Gothic as Spanish is, but one thing I notice that is kind of interesting is that you do sometimes see Goths with this duh spelling, and so that is very similar to how Spanish works. Excuse me, to how Japanese works. That you do sometimes that duh isn't always the between vowels, and whether that's actually because Goths aren't always pronouncing them as differently, whether that's because a Goth could pronounce Goth as Hod, like an Old English would say for good is Hod. I don't know. You really can't tell based on the spelling because they could be writing it just because there are forms where it has the, so they write it as the, even though they're still pronouncing it with the standard pronunciation of the. It could be that they are pronouncing it voiced, so they could be saying "goth," and it could be that they're pronouncing it as a stop. They could be saying "god," and the spelling does not really tell us which one it is, which is unfortunate. And it's probably going to stay that way until we, get a voice recording of Goths, or get some, phonetician from the 3rd century BC, 3rd century AD rather, telling us, oh, it's like this, here, that, here it's a stop, here's its plosive. That's not something I think we're going to get with Gothic anytime soon. You can see something like that for Latin. People will describe the way sounds are and how those barbarians mispronounce sounds. I think one Latin, one Roman said that, like, oh, we say cautio, but these barbarians will say cautio without a t. And I think that's interesting because in classical Latin it would be cautio, but in late Latin it becomes cautio, and you can actually see that with one of the loanwords into Gothic. It would be nice if we had more loanwords from Gothic into other languages, but unfortunately, Latin and Greek don't really make this distinction. So you can't really say based on Latin and Greek how the sounds were pronounced in Gothic, because in Latin you have w and v later, so w later becomes v, and b between vowels later becomes v, but it's still this, like, mostly v and b aren't ever real. They only contrast at the beginnings of words, and which, is kind of what we want, but it's also makes it less useful for understanding how Gothic is pronounced than if they were two completely separate sounds. I'll read what Wikipedia has to say about Japanese. The phonemes b, d, g have weakened non-plosive pronunciations that can be broadly transcribed as voiced fricatives, v, d, g, so like Gothic, although they may be realized instead as voiced approximants. But like Spanish, I don't know how to pronounce them as approximants. There is no context where the non-plosive pronunciations are consistently used, and that's what I was saying that's interesting about Goth, that it's spelled Rod. Is that the cause of that? I don't know. But they occur most often between vowels. So aburu can become aburu, And I'm not going to pronounce Japanese correctly. I haven't studied Japanese, which is why I'm using a Wikipedia article instead of something more in-depth, because it's kind of not exactly what the video is about, what the slideshow is about. And let's see, tomodachi can become tomodachi. Eigaku can become eigaku. And here especially, I highly doubt a Japanese speaker would think of these as being separate sounds. They would just think of, oh, this is one b sound, this is one d sound, this is one g sound. That just can be pronounced softer in certain environments. It's not like in English where we would say, what's a good example? I'm trying to think. Well, like sad versus sad. Sad isn't really a word. I'll try to think of one that's better. The versus the. Weather versus wetter. Is like that's distinct. Then versus den. A wolf might live in a den, but it would never live in a then. And you would say, then this happened. You might say, then this happened, if that's how your accent worked. You might diss someone, but you would never this them. So as English speakers, it might be tempting to think of Gothic as having both the and the, and I mean, which it does, but not really as, they don't contrast ever. You'll never see a word in which, oh, it has a duh, so therefore it's this word, or oh, it has a the, so therefore it's this word. It's always the environment will always tell you which one it is, except for the fact that it doesn't, because we don't know. We don't have audio recordings, but certainly they're pronounced the same by Goths. In terms of, if it's the same environment, it'll be pronounced the same. If it's in a different environment, it could be pronounced differently, but there's no contrast there. You would never be in a situation where you could say, oh, that's a wolf den, as opposed to, oh, that's a wolf den, like in English. Let's see. And interestingly, which is what's most relevant to us here, is if we take into account that the top half, very similar to Gothic, if I read the bottom half, these weakened pronunciations can occur after a vowel in the middle of a word, or when a word starting with b, d, g follows a vowel final word with no intervening pause. That's the same way it works in Spanish. 𝐻𐰼𐌼𐌱 2018 found that, as with the pronunciation of z, as z versus z. Oh, that's another thing that I really should have made a slide for, but just as you have this thing where the becomes th at the ends of words, z also becomes at the ends of words. So that's something to keep in mind. But I didn't talk about that. 𝐻𐰼�������� found that, as with the pronunciation of z as z versus z, the use of plosive versus non-plosive realization of b, d, g is closely correlated with the time available to a speaker to articulate the consonant, which is affected by speech rate as well as the identity of the preceding sound. All three show a high, over 90% rate of plosive pronunciations after. Okay, now this is interesting, because what Q represents in Japanese is what you might call gemination, and Gothic has gemination too. We don't really see gemination with b, d, g. If you see two G's together, that'll usually be pronounced ng, like in langas. becoming lungs in Gothic. Or another place you might see it is in 𝐻 and what's a good example? 𝑡rigs. And the thing about 𝑡rigs and 𝐻 is we've gotten into a lot of arguments about how to pronounce those exactly. We haven't come to any conclusions. I'm still convinced that 𝐻, which is the word for egg, is pronounced 𝐻, 𝐻, and at the beginning, and that, well, other people would say, oh, it would become 𝐻, 𝐻, and they would say that a word like 𝑤𝐷 is actually pronounced 𝑤𝐷, 𝑤𝐷, and a word like 𝑡rigs is actually pronounced 𝑡rigus, and that's certainly possible. I don't think there's any indication in spelling which one it is, and it's very hard to tell. You just have to go on what seems right. But in any case, the reason I bring it up is because the thing that's spelled DDJ or 𝍉𝐷𝐷𝐷, if you want to use the Gothic names, and the thing that's spelled GGW or 𝌻𝌰������𝌻, I think 𝌻���������� or something. I can't remember the word for the letter W. They are basically the fortified versions of 𝑦 and 𝑤, and I think everyone can agree on that part at least. And they come from Proto-Germanic 𝐼, and let's see, we have like 𝑦𝑈s, and for 𝑔𝐽 you have 𝐷𝐷𝐷, 𝐷𝐷𝐷𝐷, I guess. And that's the origin of English true and owl, which you don't have a g there. But if you look at Old Norse, you do see a g there. And as well as you get... if you speak German and you know the word for egg, it's I, not 𝐻. What happened there is basically whereas Gothic and Old Norse fortified where they fortified 𝑦 and 𝑤 when geminated to the sort of 𝑦 sounds. In West Germanic, what happened is that the first half of the that sort of merged with the beginning to become a sort of diphthong. So we have I and treu, which is very similarly pronounced, but not really. It's just a diphthong followed by a consonant, so it doesn't get fortified. Whereas like I said, in Gothic and North Germanic, it does. So when we see this Japanese Q, what that represents is gemination. There are a few words in Proto-Germanic that are reconstructed with geminated voiced plosives, or I guess geminated voiced, 𝑏𝑑𝐻. These are very rare. I think there's only like a handful of them in the entire Proto-Germanic language. And none of them happen to have been attested in Gothic. It would have been interesting to see what they would be in Gothic, but what I can say is that we do see geminated D in loan words from Greek. At least one, I think, has that. And I would recommend pronouncing that as a plosive, because it's geminated, so it was probably a plosive. And it's a similar thing to pronouncing y and w. They're clearly a plosive when they're geminated, except that you get a new w and maybe even a y. I don't think so. I don't think you get geminated y when they're loaned from Latin and ancient Greek. Let's see. After n, and that's the same as in Gothic. After m, n, ng, we expect them to be plosives. Plosive pronunciations occur at high, over 80% rates for b, d, but less frequently for g, probably because word medial g after ng is pronounced instead as a vowel or nasal, although use of ng here may be declining for younger speakers. Cross context, d generally has a higher rate of plosive realizations than b and g. So I think that's interesting. It doesn't tell us that much about Gothic, but it gives us an example of how a system like this could work, as well as Spanish also. So Gothic could be like Spanish, it could be like more like Japanese. We really can't tell based on the spelling alone. Here we have Austrian German, and I wasn't able to find a good well, the Wikipedia, it just mentioned that they could be fricatives intervocalically, and I guess this does, like, that's basically all it does too, but at least it provides some examples. So this is Austrian German. You might be familiar with Standard German, aber, oder, rege. I'm not familiar with this word, but it's a very, in Austrian German, you get a very similar system to Gothic. It also isn't always lenited, so it's also similar to Japanese. Very similar to Japanese, I would say. So we have, yeah. So we have. I don't know why it went into a German accent there. So aber. Well, I guess it was just an anticipation of saying the German words aber versus ava, ava. And once again, I highly doubt an Austrian German would think of these as distinct sounds. Oder, oder, rege, rege, rege. Or that's actually an e. It says rege, rege. So that's interesting. I don't recognize this word, but apparently it means busy. After nasal consonants, Lenis plosives are voiced. Hunde, except word finally, hund or hund. So that's interesting. A lot of the times what you'll see is that the phonology of the language also sort of interacts with this. So, for example, Japanese, tomodachi, this this da rather, actually comes from dachi, which has a ta, not a da. But this is another sound thing specific to Japanese, and maybe similar things exist in other languages. But another example would be aka from aka and kitsune. Aka kitsune. Here we have West Frisian, which also has a g distinction, which is interesting relative to Gothic, is the fact that it's pronounced as g in compounds and at the beginnings of words, which would suggest pronouncing it like that in Gothic. But the thing is, it was probably g at the beginning of words and in compounds in Proto-Germanic anyways, so this is clearly a system that developed at some point in the Frisian languages, or at least West Frisian. I haven't looked at all of them, but this clearly is not original to Proto-Germanic. This is something where g fortified to g at the beginnings of words and in compounds. This is an example of an original, let's say, Gosh, I'm so bad at thinking of words on the fly. But let's say we have a word, frithures, peace spear, Fredger, whatever, however you want to translate that. It's a male name. We have frithures, male name. And let's say in West Frisian, it becomes, well, it would not come from frithures because that would be Gothic, but if we look at Proto-Germanic, frithures, we would expect that to become like, I don't know, whatever. But I'll just say the g, so frithures, in West Frisian, because the g fortifies to g, even in compounds. And the reason we know it was g, or a g rather, in is because in Old English we have a g, y, being written the same and actually pronounced the same, where a g, original g, merges with y when it's a fricative and merges with j, or well, I guess it just becomes j when it's a plosive. So bridge versus what's a good example? Yesterday. Yesterday has this y sound. In Gothic, we have yestradachs, and so that means tomorrow. That's kind of beside the point. But in any case, the word for tomorrow in Gothic is related to the word yesterday in English, and why that is, we don't know. But in English, it clearly has a y sound, and whereas in Gothic, it's written with a g. And you do see sometimes where English y is written with a y in Gothic. Basically, every time you see a y in Gothic, that's going to become a y in Old English. So, for example, ya is yes, and yes is yes. So you have the y in both languages. You have yer being written with a g in Old English, but pronounced with a y. So generally, we do have solid evidence that it was originally in Old English, at least, as well as in Dutch. We have a h at the beginnings of words, which suggests that it was originally g. In Old Norse, rather, I don't know why I tried to say Old in English, but in Old Norse, the spelling doesn't give us any evidence. Once again, g doesn't contrast with anything. We don't really have any way to tell whether it's g or g. I think the evidence is, somewhat strong that g is original, but you could also, I suppose, say that this West Frisian system is the original Germanic one, and then in Old English and Old Norse, well, I guess not Old Norse, you could just say it's always g in Old Norse, but you could say, oh yeah, in Old English and Dutch, that was just some innovation where the g became a g. You could say that. I would disagree with that. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that despite g and g, despite it being g at the beginning of words and in compounds and g elsewhere, that doesn't really tell us anything about Gothic, unfortunately. What it does tell us, sort of, is that the other Germanic languages where we did have a merger, well, I know this happened in Old High German, at least. That could just be them, you know, fortifying. I forgot the word for a second there. Fortifying those sounds in compounds and at the beginnings of words, even if the preceding word ends in a vowel. So in Old High German especially, we always get this merger. So the always becomes d in West Germanic languages, and v always becomes b in Old High German. So Old High German provides us with no information about Gothic because we just know that it's always plosive, so that doesn't tell us anything about the Gothic distribution. 𝑉 does merge with 𝑓 in Old English. I sort of wrote this inconsistently. I guess the way I wrote it is correct. But I really should have used the 𝑓 symbol, this like phi, as opposed to an F, but whatever. And what we see in Old English is actually some evidence that it, at the beginnings of words and in compounds, it would be a plosive, as that's what we see. We see the same thing in North Germanic. Now, whether that's original is very hard to tell. I am leaning towards the fact that in Proto-Germanic, at some stage, let's say very early Proto-Germanic, perhaps even as early as like very late Proto-Indo-European, we see the Proto-Indo-European b, d, g become v, the, g in all positions is my guess, but that might not necessarily be true. And then in certain positions, they become stops. That makes sense to me. We know that something like this is happening because we actually see ⌷ in Gothic versus ⌷ in Old Norse, which suggests that the distribution of the and d isn't actually like the same in all of the early Germanic languages. What we see is they become stops in slightly different environments in each of the Germanic languages, is what that seems to suggest to me. And that sort of points to a system where originally you always have the and the ⌉. And at that point, if ⌉, the, and the ⌉ are original, then that doesn't, then the fact that it's b, d, g at the beginnings of words, or at least b, d at the beginnings of words in Old English and Old Norse, doesn't really tell us anything, because neither of those languages have the same system that Gothic does. And at that point, if they have different systems, you can't really say, oh, it works like this in that language, so therefore it must have worked like this in Gothic. To me, it makes the most sense to consider Gothic to most likely be more like Spanish or Japanese or some other language like that. But there's no solid evidence either way. So if you're going to pronounce dogs as dogs, even if the preceding word ends in a vowel, that's fine. I'm not going to correct you on that. I don't think that way is wrong. I don't think it's necessarily a worse guess than my pronunciation, but that's not how I pronounce it. And if anyone tells you that, oh, it's always dogs, it's never the, and if you pronounce it as dogs, like 𝌻𐌰𐌼𝌼, if you say it like that, you're wrong. I cannot agree with that. I cannot agree that the evidence points to 𝌻𐌰𐌼𝌼 over 𝌻𐌰����. I don't think the evidence strongly points either way. I think based on the other languages' systems that 𝌻𐌰���� is more likely, but if you take what limited evidence we have from the other Germanic languages, maybe 𝌻�������� is more likely. And that's it. That's all the slides I made.